Mike Ham joins me this week for our usual greetings from the Garden State segment. And Mike, this week we're talking about somebody I met briefly, maybe a year and a half or so ago, Mark Conklin, who was then with the traveling Grammy Museum exhibit that was at the Prudential Center. And he has something really interesting that you're focusing on.
Yeah, so once the Grammy Museum left the Prudential Center, once they decided to not do their satellite locations anymore, Mark and the team there decided to continue their educational programs for the community and kids trying to get into the media and entertainment business. And so they came up with the Record High, which is their nonprofit that they use to connect with the local community, give kids educational programs and opportunities and connections and some insights and all that kind of stuff into the industry so they can kind of learn what opportunities there are for themselves as they kind of progress in that career if that's something they want to go down.
What kind of programs do they offer?
So all sorts of things. I mean, it goes from I know they do hip hop songwriting classes, and a lot of them will do performances and different things just to try to hone in some skills if they have those skills. They also do a lot of things behind the scenes because I think, and you know this as being part of the media and entertainment industry, me to a lesser degree, but also part of it. There's so many pieces to media and entertainment. So it's not just the person on the stage, it's the person behind the scenes, producers, there's audio visual, there's lighting, there's all these different things. So they try to give these kids access to what types of things there are that the like opportunities that exist for them in this industry. Because I think like a lot of times people or, kids or adults or whoever think that if you're not a Grammy winning artist, you are not part of the media and entertainment industry. But in reality, there is so many layers to it that make the wheel turn. So they kind of do it all. They do a lot of different types of programs. But those are kind of some of the focus areas that they have.
While you're talking and describing this, it reminded me of I was in a band when I was in college and shortly thereafter, and a bunch of us who lived in the Bronx. And we had a guy with us, Mike, when I tell you he couldn't carry a note in a bucket, he had no musical aptitude whatsoever, but he loved music. He wanted to be a part. He was the guy who mixed our sound,
Yeah.
and his ear was so good however we sounded on those nights when it all clicked, it was because of him. We ended up paying him a full share as if he were a member of the band, because if he stunk, we stunk, and he was
Yeah.
amazing. So there are
Yeah.
so many other opportunities other than that person who's behind the microphone or holding a guitar or whatever it may be.
Sure. It's like I saw this interview not too long ago, and it's like an older interview, but it's with Rick Rubin, and the guy's asking him, what instruments do you play? And he's like, none. He goes, well, can you sing? He's like, nope. He goes, do you know how to work a soundboard? He's like, barely. And they're like, well, what do people pay you for? And he's like, basically that, like his ear and his confidence in the taste that he has, because there's so many people like we said before, the one of the things that we've been doing on the podcast also, and we kind of have a couple more, which we'll talk about, over the coming weeks are artists. And one of the things that in just for my own, like, weirdness, I just find the music business really fascinating and just knowing like all the different nuances to it, who gets paid, who does not get paid, who should get paid and doesn't get paid, all those kinds of things, and just kind of like learning more about that. I mean, that's like almost as important as putting together a song. Like if you know how to, especially nowadays, like work the system and know where to put your stuff and who to connect yourself with and what opportunities there are for you, you could make it a career. And you don't have to be, an incredible guitar player or a singer or, anything like that. You can make a living in this industry just doing stuff that people need to help them advance their own careers.
It's interesting that you bring up Rick Rubin, who my first experience when I heard of him was through hip hop music.
Yeah.
And here he is now doing Johnny Cash albums at the end of
Yep.
Johnny's career. And they're so stripped down and they're gorgeous. And he's worked with so many other artists, Tom Petty, for example, on Tom's solo Wildflowers album. So not to be locked into one genre. And then Mark, who's doing the Record High, comes from a gospel slash country background,
Yeah.
doing all of these things that are a long way away from that gospel slash country roots that he grew up with.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting too is like someone like Mark, who actually just released his first album, like his own personal album this year, which is a gospel album. And then you're talking about how, like they're doing hip hop writing classes. And we did talk about that a little bit. And I think one of the incredible things about that community, like the Harris Blitzer Sports and Entertainment, which own the Devils, and they do the Devils Youth Foundation, and they obviously run the Record High and all these different things. They are able to connect this community with such a wide ranging group of people. Like you imagine, like he talked a little bit about when they did have the Grammy Museum, obviously they had access to Grammy winning artists. And I forget, it might have been the Smithereens that he was talking about and how he grew up listening to the Smithereens. And all of a sudden he got a chance to like interview them and introduce them to the kids and all these things. But there's someone that, they're a Jersey band, maybe even like underrated Jersey band and kind of forgotten when you start thinking of all the Jersey bands or Jersey people that have come through in the media or the entertainment business. But like being able to connect them with kids from the Newark community that are, interested in probably things other than what the Smithereens are playing, it's still really cool because you're able to kind of pick and pick the brain of and bring in information from all these different types of artists and all that kind of stuff. And to your point, it's the business. So it doesn't matter what kind of songs you're playing, it's still the business. And how do you make a career in that business just by, knowing who to know or, knowing the right people and getting the right education and all that kind of stuff and the awareness around all of that.
You're right about it being the Smithereens, as a matter of fact. That's who I met Mark in conjunction with. And,
Okay.
one of the things through this program, the Record High, one of the first things that gets cut out of public schools is music and arts.
Yeah.
And if it's going to stay alive, if all of that's going to stay alive, and there's a correlation between a kid taking music lessons and how he or she does in math and science, for example. So it's going to have to come from the private sector, the more that it gets cut. To go back to the Smithereens, there's a Pat Denizio scholarship fund out of the Count Basie Theater in Red Bank in memory of Pat. Steve Van Zandt does this whole education program. And now here, Mark with the Record High. So if we're going to keep music and arts and that type of education in our schools and available to our students, it has to come from organizations like this.
Yeah, and it's crazy like when you really start digging and with some of the stuff that we've been working on over here, it's crazy to think how many from such a little state, how many amazing bands, artists, creatives that the state has produced. And when you, like you said, you start taking those opportunities away from kids, like why? I mean, there's, like they just had See Here Now down in Asbury Park over the weekend. You had Bruce Springsteen playing, obviously, like that's like the Mecca, right? But then Gaslight Anthem and all these other bands kind of like, in the indie circuit that are kind of on the cusp of the next big thing. So there's so many opportunities and so many examples of how you can make this work and success stories that these types of programs are imperative to kind of the culture of what we've been able to produce over our history as a state, and then kind of in the future. So if they're getting taken away, then we got to figure out ways to put it back into the hands of these kids.
And that diversity that you just mentioned, we were talking about this last week with the segment on the Azores, and we
Yeah.
had Nick Corasaniti from the New York Times, who had written a book on the Stone Pony, and he was talking about how the Asbury sound, because that's what the book was about, wasn't
Yep.
just Bruce and Southside, as you and I were talking about last week. It's so many other things. So I'm really looking forward to this segment. Mark Conklin and the Record High coming up this week. You can check it out on greetingsfromthegardenstate.com. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Jim.